But welcome everyone who joins. I'm glad that you're here, and please say hello in the chat. I see that there is a chat here. I don't know how well I'm going to be able to pay attention to the chat during while I'm talking. And I do know that it sent out an email to my list to let people know that I was going live. I don't know how many we're going to have here. So this is, like I said, is a whole new experiment for me. But today in this live, and I'm considering the possibility of doing more of these. So if you decide that you like this, please let me know. Put that in the chat. Say it somehow that I can see it, because then I can consider doing more of these in the future. But what happened a while back was I started a chat, one of those chat things on Substack where not like a note or anything, but it's a chat, so you can have a group chat. And I posed a question, and the question was, if I were to do live videos, what might be some topics you would like me to cover? And an interesting one was popped up was, so what do you think about Dan McClellan? And if you don't know, Dan McClellan is a scholar of the Bible. And by the way, I'm going to try to keep this down to 10 to 15 minutes. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to do that, but I'm certainly going to try. A good example of me getting sidetracked and where I go down rabbit holes. But anyway, Dan McClellan is a scholar of the Bible, and he is, I think his channel is called Data Over Dogma over on YouTube. And what he does, and this is the way I am going to describe what I see him doing, is I see him as addressing a significant issue in the church. And that it goes back to when I was in seminary around, we'll say this is around the year 2000. Okay. So it's been a while. And I remember an issue that was brought up that there's this gap or this disconnect between the academy, the ivory tower, whatever you want to call it, seminaries, and the pews, the churches themselves. And so there's a sense that there's the stuff that you're learning in seminary doesn't necessarily make it into the lives of the people who attend congregations. And so that creates this gap in many respects between, the clergy and the people in the pews. And I remember we were talking about that. And I think what Dan McClellan is doing ultimately is he's actually addressing that issue by taking what I would call academic biblical scholarship and making it available to the masses. And I remember when I first saw his channel a couple of years ago, I think it was on TikTok, I was like, wow, I had no idea that people were doing this kind of thing. And then I started following him and watching his videos and such like that. Now, before I talk about, what it is I like about him so much, I think it's really important to talk about, I think, the bigger issue that he's addressing in many respects. And I'm going to talk a bit about biblical scholarship in general. So you see, when I'm talking about biblical scholarship, I generally talk about two different types. One is what I'm going to call dogmatic biblical scholarship, and the other is academic biblical scholarship. And you don't want to confuse the two. So dogmatic biblical scholarship starts with a certain assumption, a certain approach to things. And the assumption is that the dogma of the Christian faith, if you will, or the one interpretation of the Christian faith, more conservative evangelical fundamentalist interpretation of faith, that dogma, the assumption is that dogma is true, absolutely positively true, and cannot be wrong. And therefore, when we look at the Bible through that lens, the assumption is that the Bible will align with that truth in all possible ways. And so what happens then is there's an understanding that because there's one truth, the Bible really only has one voice and a univocality, if you will. The theology all is the same, and ultimately there are no inconsistencies. There are no contradictions in the Bible or anything like that. So because the assumption is that the dogma is truth, Therefore, everything else will align with that. And scholarship's goal, in many respects, is to show and illuminate how it all aligns with that dogma. And so that's a dogmatic biblical scholarship. Academic biblical scholarship comes at this with very different assumptions. It assumes that the best way to get to the truth of the Bible is to use the best tools that we have at our disposal that we find in academics. So it does not assume that there's a dogma that everything else must align with. What it does is basically use what I'm going to call sort of like a scientific method of sorts to uncover what's going on in the texts and around the texts. Because if there's an assumption there, its assumption is basically this, that the texts of the Bible were written by human beings in a certain time and a certain context. And as human beings in a time and in a context, they were shaped by and participated in shaping that context. And so what they're writing is relevant in addressing the issues of their day, the questions of their day. And so when we look at it, it's like, what are they talking about? What are they worried about? Why are they worried about these things? You can look at all of that stuff using an academic lens. So we've got two very different understandings of what scholarship is in many respects. Biblical or dogmatic biblical scholarship, on the one hand, prioritizes dogma, and it says that there's nothing that you can find in the Bible that's going to overturn that, because that's the truth. The academic approach looks at it more like a quest for truth. What is happening here? What are we finding? What are we discovering when we study the Bible? So it's a very different approach. Now, for me, I am not a fan of what I call dogmatic biblical scholarship. I use the term scholarship very loosely. I recognize there's a lot of rigorous mental gymnastics that go through putting it together. But at the same time, I don't really consider it scholarship. And a good example of it, in many respects, it's a really good example. It is the key to understanding what you can call anti-intellectualism today. Here we go. So this book right here, this is this backward for you, or does this can you tell me if this is backward? I'm just curious as to how it shows up. But The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind by Mark Knoll. So Mark Knoll is, I don't know where he's at today, but I think this was written back in 2000-ish. And I think he was at Wheaton College, which is an evangelical school. And in his search for the scandal of the evangelical mind, this is the first sentence of this book. The scandal of the evangelical mind is that there is not much of an evangelical mind. And so for him, he goes through, and remember, he's an evangelical when he's writing this. So he's going through and he's arguing that, hey, we need to not be so anti-intellectual, is basically what he says. And we need basically move beyond what I call dogmatic biblical scholarship, and move more toward academic biblical scholarship. Right? And many respects, excellent. Thank you. That's good to know. And so, in many respects, what I see Dan McClellan is doing is sort of moving that forward, right? Helping people to move beyond dogmatic biblical scholarship and more into an academic biblical scholarship. So, what he does is basically he often, not always, presents passages of the Bible, and then he gives these interpretations of them. What scholar? It's less his interpretation, more like, what does scholarship say about this? What are the things that? How do scholars understand things? And he's had some videos where it's like some scholars look at it this way, some scholars look at it this way. But for the most part, his videos are challenging dogmatic biblical scholarship, because there are a lot of people who read or watch his videos And they just lose their brains like, oh my God, how can he be saying things like this? How can he say that the Bible is not univocal, that there are all these different voices out there? How can he say there's all these different theologies? There are different understandings of God in the Bible. It's one book, right? Well, that's because he's coming at it from the perspective of an academic. He doesn't assume that there's one truth that unites the entire Bible. He recognizes that there are a multiplicity of voices in the Bible. He recognizes that the multiplicity of voices sometimes are arguing against each other. And he looks at the Bible and they're understanding the meaning of the biblical passages in context. And you'll actually see me every once in a while drop a video of his in my newsletter. If you've signed up for the newsletter, you'll see me drop a video because he's good at conveying this kind of material in a way that many academics, quite frankly, probably are not so skilled at doing. Um, uh, but when I first saw him, um, when I first saw his stuff, I was really surprised because I was like, I couldn't believe that someone was actually brave enough to do this, to get this stuff out there in such a coherent way. And basically, I instantly became a fan. I'm like, oh, this is cool, right? And I mean, he's very popular among people for a reason. I mean, because he's extremely accessible. He's extremely good at what he does. But one of the reasons why I like him so much, to be honest, is because his stuff is so, what I'm going to call vanilla. It's like, it's like, this is the stuff. This is biblical scholarship. And for those who are familiar with biblical scholarship, and I'm no biblical scholar, don't get me wrong, but those who are familiar with biblical scholarship, it's like, oh, that's cool. No big deal. I mean, it's just sort of like, oh, that's a nice little insight. Someone points out something you hadn't noticed before, but it's not earth shattering. It's not like I'm going to have a crisis because he said this. It's just sort of like, oh, that's kind of neat. Right. And then I put that in my saved playlist for later because I might have a use for it. So it's like, cool. But that's not everybody's reaction. I mean, as I point out, a lot of people react very, very strongly to him. There are a lot of reaction videos to him on YouTube, by the way. And basically, they all kind of say that he doesn't know what he's talking about and everything. And then he tends to respond and show that, well, they probably don't know what they're talking about. But one of the reasons why I like him so much is not just because of what he's doing. He's really, what he's doing is he's helping people to move out of this mindset of dogma and into a mindset of, being open to critically thinking about the texts, which is a huge shift because what he's asking people to do, what he's doing is he's introducing people to the text in a way that opens them up to really thinking through the texts with what I'm going to call an adult faith, where it's not, other people aren't telling you what it means. You're looking at it, you're using tools, you're using critical tools to understand the text, and you're able to see that there's a whole bunch of ways you could look at this. And, some are much better than others, but it comes down to sort of negotiating the text and trying to figure out, what does it mean? It's not as though there's one universal truth that just you have to accept, but rather now you can explore this biblical world. And so that's a wonderful thing. But one of the things that I like about him so much really comes down to this. When I respond to him emotionally, my emotional response was like, oh, that's cool. That's neat. Is very different from, oh my God, no, how can you say that sort of thing? And that is a good reminder to me that I'm not that main target audience that he's addressing. He seems to be focusing on data over dogma. Those who are in a dogmatic mindset, he's helping them to see, to break down the idea that there's a dogmatic way to look at this, that's the way to look at this, and opening them up to a whole new way, a critical way of looking at that, right? And so he's targeting primarily I would argue, the people who are going to be transitioning from this certain dogmatic faith to more of that adult faith. Right? The adult faith that requires you to start using the critical thinking skills that you acquire more as an adult. And so that's more his personal target audience, it seems. And that it reminds me that it's not my audience. Those aren't the people really I don't think that I am meant to speak to. I feel like I'm meant to speak to the people who have sort of gone past that. And now they're in that question. So now what? Okay. I've deconstructed all that stuff. Now where do I go from here? I don't know what to do now. I mean, I'm standing out and it's like the sands are shifting and I can't seem to get my sea legs. That's terrible, sands and sea legs, but you get the idea, right? I can't seem to find my footing here. Now what? And this is more my audience, I think. Those who are seeking to reinvent Christianity, if you will. Maybe if not in the bigger picture, kind of like I'm looking at it, but even just for their own lives. What does it mean to be Christian now that I've left that stuff behind? And so part of what I like about Dan McClellan is that he reminds me of the extent to which we aren't meant to be out there for all the people. Right? There are conversations and there are arguments, if you will, and things like that he's meant to be in that I would argue is not where I am meant to be. And so he's doing his thing. I'm doing my thing. And this is an example of how when we do our things, when we stay in our lanes, we focus on what we're doing. We don't have to look at other people and say, oh, maybe I should be doing that. Instead, stay in your lane in many respects. And then you're working together for a much wider sense of impact in this world. And so that I think is part of what I really like about him, because everything, it's important to self-reflect on things. And for me, part of that is um, learning about who I'm meant to be in this, shall we say, marketplace of ideas as me, not as someone else. So that's my bit on Dan McClellan and more specifically, I guess, biblical scholarship as a whole. And I hope you've enjoyed this. If you have some questions, go ahead and pop a question or two in the chat if you got any questions. If you don't, and that's okay too. But meanwhile, I've been talking a lot, so I'm going to get a drink. And again, one of the things that I had mentioned earlier on, I don't know if everybody was here, but um, I mean, if you enjoyed this, let me know because if I want to do these again, I mean, I want to make sure that people want me to do these from time to time. And if I do these, I don't know how regularly I would do them. I'm not really sure what it would look like. Like I said, I wanted to keep it between 10 and 15 minutes. I've already gone over by 4 minutes. It's 19:03 right now. But if no one has questions or thoughts or anything they want to share, I'm going to go ahead and pop off of here. And I hope you've enjoyed this. And if I do this again, I hope to see you again next time. If you want to know, if you are not already on my email list, and subscribe to my Substack. And if you want to get an alert when these are going to go live, apparently I click a thing and it says, send email to people whenever you go live. I'm like, okay, sure, I'll do that, right? And I'll try to post notes and everything. So thank you very much. I am glad that you appreciated this. And well, until next time, peace.